welcome Professor Campbell to Oxford University. Professor Campbell is a colleague from Syracuse University in New York State, USA, and he's here in Oxford where he gave a lecture entitled Black Joy and the Spectre of Fascism. And today I'm going to ask him some questions that were provoked by the lecture he gave. So, Professor Campbell, you started your talk with the strategic failure of the USA in Iran. Could you explain what you meant by that?
By the spectre of fascism first and then strategic failure. I use the word spectre in the same way that Karl Marx in the 19th century used the word spectre to describe communism as a pervasive yet intangible threat that terrified the European bourgeoisie in the 19th century. What Marx was saying was the spectre was based on the reputation of communism before it was a reality, of communism that had not yet arrived in Europe. Marx wanted to turn that fear of communism into something of a concrete plan by the working peoples of Europe to fight against the capitalist class and to bring about a new society. What Marx said is, when he was writing about communism, is that the ruling class in Europe was talking about communism everywhere, but communism was nowhere. In this present period, there are many people talking about fascism without defining what is fascism. Fascism is everywhere and yet nowhere, because people identify fascism with the personalities around the leadership of the United States of America. I wanted to present in my paper that fascism was decisively defeated in Europe in the 20th century. But what we see in the United States of America is not fascism, but a continuation of the deep brutality of racial capitalism that has been existing in the United States of America from the time of slavery, Jim Crow, the genocide of the Native American people, exploitation of immigrant workers, and seeking to divide the working peoples of the United States. And the argument we're making is that throughout all of these periods, Black Joy, the spiritual essence of the people who were fighting against racial capitalism, provided the backbone of the struggle against capitalism. In this period, when the US capitalism is seeking to bring about full-blown capitalism, the lecture on Black Joy was to seek to chart a course of how that joy could be developed into a clear political program for defeating those would-be fascists and to chart a course for reconstruction beyond racism and destruction.
But could you say, many have said that what we see now is the beginning of the end of fascism. But you're now saying that fascism ended at the end of the Second World War.
In Europe. In Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, fascist forms have always existed. And the challenge in the United States of America is to once and for all reveal the brutality of racial capitalism beyond its legalistic, liberal, democratic form, to defeat that form of US racism and capitalism at this present moment.
So, of course, there were members of the audience who looked to what was happening, what had just happened in Hungary with Orban losing the election, and saying, well, that's not the end of fascism or fascistic type behavior in Hungary, because Orban was replaced by a nationalist who stood to the right of him on migration. What would you say, how would you interpret the Hungary outcome and the Hungary situation?
I would interpret the Hungary situation in line with the developments in Europe in the past 30 years. What has happened in Europe in the past 30 years is neoliberal capitalism sought to take away the basic rights of the working people of Europe. Rights to education, rights to health care, rights to housing, rights to decent livelihood. And these neoliberal attacks on the working people of Europe were supported by Western imperialism. Orban did not come to power outside of the attacks against communism and socialism and social democracy. So what the victory over Orban did was to bring back a mainstream neoliberal leadership as we've seen in the rest of Europe. Britain has the same direction in relationship to neoliberalism. So, but the point is, the crudeness of the Orban appeal to crude nationalism was not in line with the kind of liberal democratic face that the West sought to present. And increasingly it is clear that from the time the IMF went into Russia with Yeltsin and went into Eastern Europe, the Eastern European capitalists who have arisen in this period are allies of Western capitalism, and they have a symbiotic link with German, French, British, and US capitalists.
Thank you. I mean, one of the theme of the workshop that you attended and where you gave this presentation was about authoritarianism and fascism and how they manifest themselves in what we describe as the global north and the global south. Are there differences in terms of them in terms of their appearance in these different political spaces?
There are differences, and what we need to do for political organizing purposes is to distinguish between statements about a regime being fascist and the real essence of fascism. Because the results are really the same if you think of what Mobutu Sese Seko has done in the Congo over a 30-year period. If you think of what Pinochet has done over a 20-year period in Chile, or what Suharto did, it is no less destructive than that what was visited on the people of Spain or Italy or Germany. But the important difference in the case of Mobutu or Chile is that the ruling classes in these societies did not have the political or economic autonomy to hold power by themselves. That is, Mobutu did not come to power because of the power of the capitalist class in the Congo. Mobutu came to power because of the intervention of the CIA and the Belgian capitalists to kill Patrice Lumumba and to destroy the Liberation and Independence Project. Similarly, in Chile. In Chile, when the people of Chile voted to strengthen socialist orientation, Kissinger in the United States supported Pinochet to take power and that brutal dictatorship. The point is, we need to distinguish politically and intellectually the difference between authoritarianism and fascism, because a fascist state requires a massive mobilization, and it requires that people organize internationally. But internationally, people in the peace movement in Europe and North America described Mobutu as simply a kleptocrat and did not link their own livelihood to the relations between the United States and the Congo, or between the United States and Chile. What it requires is deeper solidarity between the working peoples of Europe and working peoples of Africa, because none of these dictators can survive without the intelligence agencies of the United States and Western Europe. Now, the difference between this and authoritarianism is that, according to the academics, authoritarianism comes from a police state like Idi Amin, a police state like that of Sisi in Egypt, or a police state like the one we have in Myanmar. So in a police state, we have the monopoly of state power, we have a concentration of power and brutality of the working people. Under fascism arises of a crisis of capitalism in an advanced capitalist country. And it is requirement of the bourgeoisie to dispense with liberal democratic forms, such as elections, to brutally exploit the working peoples of Europe. And as Fanon and as Césaire said, this fascism that exploded in Europe was always existing in Africa. So the point about the working peoples of Europe is how can they understand that history of colonialism, racism, so that they themselves be liberated from concepts of white supremacy that made them accomplices in the colonial enterprise. So the challenge for the moment has been made more explicit by the war against the Palestinian peoples. The war against the Palestinian peoples has shown that the state of Israel has been able to commit genocide against the Palestinian people. But the genocidal actions of the Israeli state required the complicity of US capitalism and US imperialism. And now, for the first time in the 70-year history of the state of Israel, large sections of the United States population and the political class are now questioning the US unlimited support for Israel. Last week, Saturday, there is a very popular program in the United States called Saturday Night Live. And for the first time in the history of Saturday Night Live, they were able to criticize Israel. So what we have in the United States is when political scientists wrote books about the Israeli lobby and their influence in the United States of America, people dismissed that book. But now it is very clear to all sections. So even people in the military are saying that the United States did not go to war against Iran for its own reasons. It was following the lead of Israel. And this is a moment for us to clarify why the struggle for peace in Iran, the struggle for peace in Palestine, the struggle for peace in Gaza, the struggle for the people of Cuba are all interrelated at this moment of crude militarism and destruction.
So, thank you. Is that therefore what you mean by the strategic failure of the USA in Iran?
Yes. I use a stronger word. I said strategic defeat.
Strategic defeat.
It was a stronger word. And in fact, the New York Times this week wrote about, is what's happening in Iran a Suez moment, which is a discussion of how Britain was militarily dominant over Egypt in 1956. But what happened in Suez in 1956 was a strategic defeat for Britain. What followed from the strategic defeat of Britain? It followed that defeat inspired and encouraged liberation movements in Africa, in Egypt, in Kenya, in Southern Africa, in Angola, in Tanzania, and the independence struggles in Africa further weakened British imperialism. It weakened the British financial control and their dominance in the financial system. It weakened the moral authority to the point where British academics and intellectuals, led by Anthony Crosland, had a long debate in British political science journals about whether we should be discussing Suez or not. So we have a similar situation at the moment in the United States of America, where the strategic defeat of the United States of America is creating a cultural and intellectual crisis inside the United States. There was an editorial this week in the New York Times asking, has the United States faced a Suez moment? But this is rich for the New York Times that has been supporting Israel and the United States in Iran and in Gaza. But what it means is that the moral, political, and diplomatic legitimacy that the US or Israel had from this war has eroded. Now, what are the consequences of strategic defeat? Moral collapse, moral and diplomatic and international legitimacy. And this is where the strategic defeat for the United States have implications for the future of the dollar and the future of the petrodollar system.
Could you explain a bit more about the role of the dollar in this conflict?
Yes. Well, the United States since 1944 has been in a very, very, a position that has been unlike any other major powers in the history of imperialism. That the United States, when the Bretton Woods system said that the international trading system would be based on the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to $35 to a price of gold, to 1 ounce of gold, it was accepted that the British pound and the US dollar would be the main trading currencies. By 1971, the United States had exhausted itself in fighting wars against people, as in Vietnam. And so the United States went off the gold standard. And this is why academics and President de Gaulle talked about the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, because the United States could continue to print dollars even though it was in debt. Now, what has happened since the fall of the Soviet Union is that the Europeans sought to separate themselves from the US dollar because they felt that they were subsidizing the US financial system. And so they set up the euro. And the euro represented a threat insofar as that oil could be traded in the euro instead of dollars. So the fact that oil could be traded in the euro meant that the US for the first time had competition. And that's why many have said that the war against Saddam Hussein and against Iraq was because Saddam Hussein threatened to price its selling of oil in the euro. Now, what has happened since the United States spent $8 trillion fighting a losing war in Afghanistan and in Iraq? Many countries have sought to leave this petrodollar system. The Chinese set up what was called a petro-yuan system. And the Chinese, along with BRICS, are trying to set up an international payment system which is separate from the US dollar. Now, Venezuela, Russia, and Iran were the prime allies of China in setting up this petro-yuan system. The United States decided to militarily take out Venezuela and Iran because other countries producing oil, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Iraq, had been hedging to get into this petro-yuan system. This was a fundamental threat to the future of the US dominance and financial system. So the strategic defeat of the United States of America has the possibility of undermining the petrodollar system. And this is the tension that we are under at the present moment. And that's why we must intensify the efforts to explain the illegal action that the United States is taking by their actions against the people of Libya and freezing the resources of Libya, the actions against Russia and seizing the assets of Russia, the actions against the people of Venezuela, because the United States have now resorted to kidnapping and abrogation of what they call the rules-based international system. The dollar had been built on what was called a rules-based international system. And it's not by accident that the former governor of the Bank of England, who's now the Prime Minister of Canada, is the one raising the alarm about the rules-based international order. The rules-based international order has collapsed. The question for people in Africa and global Africa is, will African people reorganize to break from the euro, the French franc, and the US dollar, and to set up independent African financial and monetary system backed by the African gold? This is why in Africa I've been proposing the Pan-African Gold Council. But before that point can be reached, we must fight for the rights of the African workers who work in mines all over Africa. So this is a very delicate moment for the African working people. And whether Africa succeeds in delinking from international capitalism is dependent on the extent to which we build our strength among the working peoples and strengthen their organizations to fight against dictatorship and oppression in Africa.
I mean, the unraveling of the rules-based order, how will that affect Africa? Because we could say that Africa was never really benefited from that rules-based order. It just maintained the impoverishment of people on the continent. So, yeah, how obviously people in the North, global North, in the UK, where we are worried about this. How should Africa respond to that unraveling?
Well, one way I think we must respond is by exposing the hypocrisy that you've just identified. That when Denmark or Britain or France or Canada cry about the rules-based international order, Africans should ask, what has been the role of France in Africa? What is the role of Denmark as a colonial state? Or what is the role of Canada as a junior ally of the United States of America? So for Africa and the African peoples, it is time for us to get rid of the CFA franc in Africa. It is time for the African people to delink from the US dollar and set up the African currency that Kwame Nkrumah spoke about more than 50 years ago. So the challenge for Africa is that you're correct. The rules-based international order did not exist for Africa under apartheid. The rules-based international order did not exist when they killed Patrice Lumumba. The rules-based international order did not exist when they went in and destroyed Libya. And the rules-based international order does not cover the destruction of the environment in the Niger Delta by Shell. But all of these, the fact that Western capitalists are talking about the rules-based international order, should inspire us to work harder to bring Shell to heel and to expel them from Africa, to bring the Libyan authorities who work with the United States to order, and to bring the Congolese who are linking with foreign imperialists to order. So this is an opportunity for the progressive forces to reorganize and strengthen themselves.
Many people, certainly in the West, are in despair, right, with the news with and there's a certain degree of pessimism about the future because of what they see as the rise of Trumpism, the dominance of the oligarchs, and so on. And one of the things that inspired us listening to your talk was your use of the concept of Black joy to explain how we might survive in the face of a potential terror. Could you explain to us what you mean by Black joy?
Yes, thank you. This was the basic message I wanted to bring. And this is the message that we bring in the Black liberation movement, in the global Pan-African movement, and in Pan-African spaces. We draw inspiration from African peoples who, in the midst of the brutality of enslavement, did not allow slavery and capitalism to destroy their spiritual essence. Black joy is drawing on that spiritual essence from music, leisure, movement, dance, singing, and the kind of community engagement which ensured the humanity of the African peoples. In all parts of Africa, in the midst of the brutal enslavement, Africans drummed and sang and inspired themselves. And mothers sang to their children, "You are not born a slave. You are not always going to be a slave." And they inspired people. Inside of Black Africa, people do not die. They join the ancestors. And they said, it is better to die fighting to be free than living as a slave. So Black joy stems from that long tradition. When Tara Hunter wrote the book, To Joy My Freedom, she was writing about former enslaved women who did not allow the KKK to restrain their freedom, to stop them from dancing and worshiping and moving and to have their self-expression as human beings. And this tradition of enjoying oneself has run through Black and Pan-African life from the time of slavery through colonialism to neo-colonialism. And it is that Black joy we're trying to unearth, but bringing together that joy with the organizational experience of those who have been fighting to create a new society, who are trying to build social reconstruction for Black people beyond capitalism. So whereas Black joy in the civil rights movement brought about Marvin Gaye and Aretha Franklin, and we had what was the legalistic challenges to racism, Black joy in this period is calling for a new conception of society beyond capitalism, because the Black Lives Movement has shown that we cannot get freedom and justice under neoliberalism, under capitalism, and so in the destruction of the planet Earth. So the Black joy is the anchor for the framework how we're going to conceptualize rebuilding society, because the point we know that fascism will be defeated. They were defeated in Europe, they will be defeated in the United States of America. So the role of the progressive intellectual, the progressive activist, is to be able to chart what kind of organizational, political, and economic structures that must be built in the defeat of fascism and fascist tendencies at this moment.
Thank you. I mean, one of the, I was thinking about joy and where people look for joy and hope, especially from about the late 20th century onwards, with impoverishment caused by structural adjustment programs, authoritarian leadership, and wars. And people seem to have turned to organized religion, whether Christianity or Islam, for joy and hope. But we have seen that these religious organized religion can be oppressive forces because they tend to be hierarchical, gendered, and even homophobic. How would you interpret this trend towards religion as as a space for black joy?
Well, religion has always been a space for black joy because the autonomy of the black church in the period of enslavement was a space for refuge. I was born in Jamaica, and every one of the preachers every one of the rebellions were led by religious leaders. So so it was in the United States of America with the major religious leaders who fought against slavery. So religion was not simply something to wish to go to heaven. It was associated with spiritual strengthening to be able to face the slave masters. What has happened? Since the massive mobilization in the United States of America, since the message of Martin Luther King to turn religion into spiritual freedom and political liberation, there's been a massive investment into what is called evangelical Christianity. And evangelical Christianity, Chris Hedges has written a book about this called Christian Fascism. And he goes back to the evangelical movement in the United States of America. But it took a particular form in the era of Reagan and Thatcher, when the right-wing religious movements supported apartheid and went into Mozambique and Angola and had these organizations to say they're going to save Africa from godless communism in Mozambique and Angola and the ANC. And that kind of Christian fundamentalism, rooted in the very conservative evangelical churches in the United States of America, have gained billions of dollars from the conservative capitalist classes. And so we have a new class of leaders in Africa and in the black community called evangelical preachers. And the instrument of their accumulation of capital is the mega church. And these leaders, it seems, that the more conservative you are, the more you represent ideas about women that are degrading, the more homophobic you are, the more money you will get from the evangelical spaces. So we have two movements going at the same time. That historic movement of people using religion as inspiration and hope to fight against capitalism and oppression and police violence, and that movement of the mega churches and the big capitalists who have now turned themselves into religious leaders. Now that tension is being fought out on a day-to-day level, and the balance of forces will be dependent on the extent to which we're able as progressive forces to link up with these progressive preachers. Like in the case of Martin Luther King, the United States now said that the march in Washington was organized by communists, and they now try to delegitimize those around Martin Luther King while separating Martin Luther King from his message of peace and justice for the working people. So they talk about Martin Luther King having a dream and not talking about Martin Luther King organizing with sanitation workers in Memphis. Similarly, today, we have progressive leaders like Reverend William Barber, who is a main force in the anti-Trump and anti-authoritarian campaign in the United States of America. And at the same time, you have other religious leaders who are homophobic and who oppress women. And so that struggle is going to be fought out. It is not going to be decided overnight. And we have to find ways of engaging that struggle and to ensure that within our families, we do not tolerate those who represent the ideas of white supremacy, that it is God's will that the United States is fighting with Israel against Iran. because there's so many churches in our communities in Africa, the Caribbean, and in the United States that are saying that what Israel is doing is ordained by God and we should support it.
Thank you. Yes, let's keep, I think our final question will really be about the kind of political organizing that should be done in Africa at the moment. We've seen these sham democracy elections that have taken place, and they have produced successive authoritarian leaders. But there's also a lot of critique. I mean, a lot of Africans favor what is going on in the Sahel states, whilst others are critical of it, especially people external here in the West. How should we read that? What kind of political organizing? How should we take what is happening, in Burkina Faso and elsewhere? How can we interpret it? How can how can we understand what is going on?
Well, we understand what's going on from the deep desire of the African people for a better quality of life. That the vast resources of Africa are used to change the living conditions of the people. And on some issues, we definitely need to strengthen the united front against ecocide. Poor organizing forces organize the environmental justice movement in Africa. In the environmental justice movement that places capitalism as the main criminal force behind ecocide in Africa, Western NGOs came in to undermine that work and to turn environmental justice into simply using phrases that does not change the conditions. The best example of this is in Nigeria, where we had the killing of Ken Saro-Wiwa. And I would say that many young Nigerians under the age of 20 years old do not know about Ken Saro-Wiwa. So the massive campaign for environmental justice, for cleaning up the environment in Nigeria, that's not a working class issue. That's an issue for all Nigerians. And the extent to which the Nigerian capitalist class continued to be a passive and active ally of Western capitalists in shipping billions of dollars out of the country while the country is divided without basic access to services is a challenge for the Nigerian working people and for all of us. So environmental justice, basic social needs, food, clothing, shelter, electricity, decent education. These are not radical and revolutionary struggles, but these are rights that cannot be accessed by the working people without a struggle against the current ruling class in Africa and the Caribbean and the United States of America. So the class struggle inside the Black communities have intensified, and the intensification of that struggle come from the clarification of activists that we should not compromise with the Black middle class and the Black bourgeoisie that want to divide Black working peoples. Let me give you an example. On the 25th of March, 2026, the United Nations had this landmark resolution that the slave trade and slavery constituted the gravest crimes against humanity. This was the culmination of centuries of work by progressive Pan-Africanists on the question of reparations and reparative justice. In Africa, the African ruling classes that were complicit with colonialism and neocolonialism cannot discuss this UN resolution. And they would say in Africa that, oh yes, but Africans sold other Africans. That kind of debate undermines any effort to understand how capitalism slavery operated. Similarly, in the United States of America, the scholarship of some who talked about money and how much reparations going to be paid are going to talking about who's eligible for reparations, drawing distinctions between African Americans and African Caribbeans and Africans from the continent of Africa. So the middle class in Africa, the Caribbean, and North America are dividing the mass of working people from each other. So these struggles have to intensify, and that's where the role of the intellectuals come in. Because in the United States of America, this campaign about African descendants of slavery is most intense among university students. It is not clear that this is having any root among the black workers who have to go out every day and struggle, and the black and the workers who are Latino workers or Caribbean workers, and the extent to which we struggle against police brutality, against the violence of the state against the people, is the extent to which we will rise above these divisive tendencies in the community.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We'll have to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for this engaging discussion.